Hey y'all, okay, so today we are going to continue the series on the antique interior style mortise lock. I'll try to stay in frame here. So like I said in the other video, or like I posted on the other video, I'm going to split this up into three different ones. Now I do have all the keys out here. I started to do like an all-in-one type video where I'm making the key and I'm refurbishing it, or I'm refurbishing it I should say first, because if somebody brings you an old lock, your first step is going to be to refurbish the lock to make it work correctly before you even really need to think about a key. So this is going to be in part three, just to split it out to make it a little bit shorter. So today what I'm going to do, I'm just going to move these out of the way for right now. You can see there's a bunch of keys, but again, before we even begin the process of making the key, we're going to need to refurbish the lock and get it working correctly. And if you remember, this is the lock that I put the spring in wrong, and it is not working right. So again, what you will find is almost always 100-year, 50 years of paint, several layers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one apart and I'm going to kind of talk about some of the interior, a little bit more detail, what I did not go over last time. So what you're going to need to refurbish it, these locks, is going to be a screwdriver to take it apart and to scrape. Rubber gloves is pretty necessary, and an old tin lid. If you get Christmas cookies and you don't need the tins, these tin lids make great containers because we are going to have to soak a little bit of this to get the goo off or to clean it. So let's go ahead and take it apart. Now, as I mentioned in the first video and then put the lock back together incorrectly, you have to take a picture of the inside so that you can put it back together correctly. So I'm going to take this offending spring out that I put in upside down. I'm going to put it back in right side up, like I should have done to begin with. And then we're going to come up here and take a photo of it. Okay, so we took our photo of the first part. You couldn't see all of it, so you want to take multiple photos. The more complicated, the more parts there are. You want to take off what you just took a photo of. So we're going to take that spring out and we're going to set it aside. We're going to take the lever. So one lever lock, again, very common in the US market to just have the one lever. And if we look close at this lever, it actually says 5. So presumably that is a 5 depth. It's got a pretty big kind of swoop here. So that means the center of the key is going to have to be cut pretty well. And we're going to go over that in the key making video. But again, you have to do this before you really do anything. Take your bolt out, and it does help to kind of lay everything out as you take it out. So, we would do this and then this and then this. Now, hold your hand over this because this spring can pop out. You want to be careful not to lose anything when you're working on it. And take your spring out here. Set it aside. Now that we've gotten to that, we want to take another photo so that we remember how this part is. Okay, got a photo of that. So now we're going to take this hub, which is where the spindle goes through for the doorknob, and this other spring right here. Now, you want to be very careful with these springs because they are usually pretty old, and you can recreate these springs sometimes, but it is not a great fun thing to do to get this exact bend. Sometimes the exact bends aren't necessary, but you do have to be kind of close. So once we get all that off, we have the case parts. So as we can see, we've got to get some paint off here. We've got to clean that faceplate up. The interior, after I got that spider web out, is actually fairly clean. But a lot of the times you will have a huge buildup of paint in this area right here that you're going to have to scrape up and scrape off. And we've only got it on the edge there. So typically, again, the faceplate is your main culprit, getting this cleaned up and smoothed out. So you can go about this a couple of ways. You can scrape. Now, of course, that's going to leave scratches. But depending on the level of refurbishing you want to go through, you can soak it. If you scrape it like I'm doing here, I will show you how to fix those little problems. Soaking it in a stripper will definitely work if necessary. Sometimes it's not necessary. We have scratches all underneath that. I mean, these were already there. So, you know, if you're, say, at a house that has these and you don't want to sit and wait 10 minutes or 15 minutes for it to soak, then you can just come through usually and just scrape all this off. At this point, we're going to want to put on our rubbers. Bend over, boys. Take off any watches or cover it up if you're going to be messing with chemicals. Again, most of the time this dried paint is pretty easy just to flake off, and a lot quicker, especially when you see that there's scratches already on it. You're not really harming anything. Now, you can use any kind of edged tool, putty knife or stiff putty knife or a true scraper, but no reason not to use a screwdriver when I got it in my hand here. Now, I am going to soak this just so that we can see. Okay, so I got most of that off. Soaking it will kind of prepare the metal and get any little parts off, and also get into this area. And on the underside, we want to get all this off. Around the edges, because this is your main issue on latch and bolt operation. So you want to get in the edges here. Now you see these files to the side. I had those out again because I thought I was going to do the key making part as well as the refurbishing part. I don't think I am. Now, sometimes these are attached to the case, like they're not really made to come off. So if that's the case, get it, case? If that's the case, then you will have to do it with it on. You don't really want to mess around a lot by bending or refolding these tabs, because again, this is old stuff. Not a good idea to bend old metal. Now this one is not bad, but we're going to look at the latch. We can see we have buildup of paint there. So let's just go ahead and scrape most of it off. Before we soak it, so it can kind of get in there and get cleaned up a little bit better. Ooh. one thing to look out for when you get to this point, again, is to make sure this is not bent. You want that to be straight. Typically this or the bolt will bend. And again, we're going to true this surface after we soak it. We're going to true this surface down a little bit, because as I mentioned in the first video, when this latches into, pretend like this is the strike plate, but when this latches into the plate, it's holding right here. Oh, where am I? Like this would be up against the plate, and when you pull the bolt, when you turn the handle, the bolt slides on that. So what happens is it will dish out, it will become non-true or non-flat. So if that's the case, then we're going to have to true it up a little bit, flatten it down with a file, and make sure again that it's not bent. A lot of times this will bend here. You can put it in a vise, clamp it up, and just carefully tap it to get it straight again. This one almost looks like it's bent, but it's not. And we're going to get the bolt. Get all that paint off the bolt as well. Now at this point, depending on how much you want to get, how far you want to go with the refurbishing, at this point we are actually good to put it back together. You know, when you're talking on the locksmith side, when you're talking with your customer about doing this and you quote them a price, you're going to quote them a price based on how far you think it needs to go. Of course, it varies from lock to lock. If you have a whole house full of these, one may be more heavily painted than another one. So beware of that. There could be variable work involved with cleaning these up. Variable amounts of work, I should say. And I'm just going to go through here and make sure we got most of the dried paint off. And we see it's pretty scratched up, so we're gonna fix that. We're gonna assume that somebody wanted this looking and working as good as possible. In other words, top price for refurbishing these. But again, we could just slap it all back together and it would probably work fine. Okay, see that? See that sticky right there? That's what you don't want. And that may just be from me holding it wrong, but so that's coming all the way out. That's not. So there's something going on from this point to there, and it is more than likely the lacquer. So once we get it cleaned up and soaked and smoothed off, that should work fine. So these are the three parts. Usually never soak springs, not a good idea, because you know, compound that you're using. You want to check this, the hub, which is what the spindle goes through. You want to make sure it is not cracked or messed up in any way or wallowed out. It needs to fit pretty tight, which this one does. Hey! Okay, let's take this over here. Again, I don't know where I left off, but going back to that, just in case I missed it. You just want to make sure that the hub here is not cracked or messed up or does not have debris on it, kind of like right here. Because if this is not smooth, it will act up. But we will come back to that after we soak the parts here. just going to start with some goof off. Basically make a little lake there and let it sit for about 10 minutes. Let us take this out. Got a fresh pair of rubber gloves on. So depending on the level of the paint, you may have to use a commercial stripper. But this one was not painted too bad, so we're just going to try it with the goof off because I was able to scrape most of that paint off. Get the edges of this here, which is not that big of a deal because the edges are usually recessed down. But while I'm doing this, I'm going to go ahead and clean it off here. And dry it. And try to come up with another use for this lake of goof off. Or I could just sit here and smell it for a while. Always use goof off in a well ventilated room. Right. Okay. Well, let us set this aside for right now. Somewhere where it'll fall over and splash and make a big mess. Okay. So after you get all the paint off, whether it's through a commercial stripper or just goof off and scraping it, we have all these scratches. Now we also have this kind of neat patina, so you don't really want to mess it up. But I take 1200 sandpaper, and it says 120, but it's actually 1200. Very, very fine sandpaper. And I'm just going to come in and knock this down. Again, you could go all the way with this and keep on sanding. Start with a heavier grit sandpaper and sand until your scratches are gone. Sand until your scratches are gone. But I'm not going to do that really, unless somebody wants it done top price, obviously. And you get the idea there. Clean up. Alright, and then we're going to clean up this latch. So like we talked about before, we're going to true it up. So you can use needle files, or you can use a regular file, or you can use sandpaper and just progress down. But I just take a bastard file. You bastard! Take a bastard file. You don't want to take a lot of this off, so you got to be kind of careful with it. But you can see when you hold it flat and then scrape, you see the high points that are coming off there. So that means it is not really flat. So again, not taking a lot off. You just want to smooth the surface down a bit. See as we go, see that center. So basically it did have a dish out a little bit. Doesn't have to be perfect, but you do want to kind of smooth it as much as possible. And then the edges, you just want to lightly hit those edges that are rough. And then I'm gonna, once we get back over to the case, I'm gonna show you why you don't want to really take this too far. here you have a flat surface and then a flat surface. It's kind of like a chisel almost. So you can take it and hold it like you were sharpening a chisel. Let me see what it's doing there. Again, you want to be very careful not to take too much material off. And the other edge. Alright, and I left it like this. It's no need to go all the way down. What that does is it just gives you a flat surface. I've actually got a strike plate right here. I could probably grab it and show you. I do not have a strike plate right there. I'll grab a strike plate in a little bit. And then again on the bolt here, if you want to do the same thing, this particular bolt is not bad at all, so I'm just going to hit it with the sandpaper instead of the file. I normally have 600 grit sandpaper, and that's what I always started with. I go from 600 to 1200, but I just discovered that I had used my last little round thing of 600 grit sandpaper, which makes me sad. So I'm gonna have to replace that somehow. I ordered these from a knife making company, I believe, a long time ago. We can still see the original seam on the bolt there. You can take it off if you want to, but it's been there for a while with no problem, so no real need to do this again. But you do want all surfaces kind of smoothed off, no rough points on them. Now, typically, this is about as far as you really need to go. Again, on this one, you want to make sure it is flat and not bent, because if the door has been hit a lot or something, it can bend it. But there is really no need for this particular one. Your mileage may vary depending on which. Now, remember this had a problem coming out all the way. So I'm going to go ahead and tend to that problem now by smoothing it. And you can use, like I said, you can use a needle file for this. Or, you know, if you don't have a big file, you can always use a small one to do the same thing. It's just a little bit easier and quicker with a larger file. So I'm going to take that. Okay, so that should be good. We could true that up a little bit more, but again, it's not overly necessary. Doesn't have to be perfect. These things are pretty forgiving on tolerances. All right, so let's move back over here and put it back together. So, time to put it back together. I'm going to take a paper towel with some of that goof off in it and just kind of get those spider webs out, get any dirt or debris typically that would come in through the openings, get it out of the way. I forgot to scrape that paint off, so we'll go ahead and scrape this. Maybe. There we go. Just get that off. Otherwise, we're in pretty good shape. So we're going to put it back together, and again, I'm going to do a whole nother separate video on making the key for it. So that will be part 3 for sure. If you have any rust on this, we'll see some rust here. You may want to hose it down or put some oil in it. This is the case when you can get your 3-in-1 oil. Perfectly fine. Any kind of light type oil like that would be fine to do that. Put in there, but I'm not going to do that right now because I got to make a key for it. Thumbs up, man. Because I have to make a key for it in part 3, and I'm not going to mess with the oil in it while I'm doing that. So we'll oil it up once we get done with making the key. So we're going to grab our faceplate, snap it back in. Now, remembering which way the door went before we get to that. If it is a right-hand door or the hinges are on the right-hand side of the door and it swings out, you want it. I can see there we fixed our problem. Now the latch is coming all the way out. But we want it with the angle that way if the door swings out. If the door swings in, we want the latch angle facing this way because it has to ride along this latch and push in. And likewise, if the hinges are on the left of the door and it swings in, you would want the latch to be whichever way it needs to be. So as you're putting it back together, you hopefully will know which way the door was, or if it was brought into you, always remember which way the latch was facing, which you can do by looking at your picture. So on this one, we are going to put the hub back in, which went this way. And going back on our picture, we see that this spring hooked around this and pressed into the hub. Seat your spring. You may need to hold it depending on how jumpy it is. Then we had this spring. I always just like kind of stretch this one out. It needs a little stretching from being squished up for so many years. So I kind of untwist, stretch, untwist. It's a little bit bent, so kind of give it a little bend and stretch it out a good bit. It doesn't really matter how I put this back on because this is just stock, so I'm just going to stock it like in-swing door right-hand hinge and drop it down so that the hub, when it turns, is pulling that back. And we will get this and show you. So when you turn your knob, it pulls your latch back. If you take this out, we can see what this other spring does. I mentioned it again in the other video, but there is a variety of this style of spring that basically gives you kind of tension on your hub. Sometimes there's a notch in the top of the case with just a flat spring, and it kind of is oriented this way. But again, this one is like that, and I can actually pop this apart and probably show you. I hadn't even looked in this, but let's see. So there we have a totally different setup. Same theory, different setup. You see the flat spring coming across and grabbing onto this bar, which again, when you turn the hub with your spindle, it pushes down on that spring. So that gives you the springy function of it with just a different layout. And even this one is probably going to be different as well. Similar but different. Still got the flat spring along the top. Wait, where are we? There we go. Still got the flat spring. This is actually the more common style. This is more of an unusual style. Yale, these are Corbin. And there's a dozen makers of these that made them throughout the years, but this is more commonly what you will find with that. But you can see the similarities, just slightly different, you know, spring type action and a few different, slightly different parts. But they all invariably kind of go back together pretty much the same way. We can see the different spring here too that presses down on this lever. So it really is totally dependent on the style of lock. Wait, this is this one. The style of lock you're working on. They all work similar, but slightly different. And you may have, typically again, you'll find them on the same house, you'll find them to be mostly all the same, unless somebody has come along and switched one out. There's our spring. I was gonna say, where'd our spring go? Okay, so putting this back in doesn't matter. I'm just gonna put it over that and squeeze the spring down in there. We're gonna take our bolt, make sure it is the right way. So I'm gonna get more heavily into this during the key making part of it. But basically what your key does is your key throws this. It hits in this and makes it move. And then when you turn it the other way, it pulls it back. So that goes in. As you're assembling it, make sure it goes in and out. And our lever hooks on there and goes in like that. So we hold it up, put our key in, the key lifts up that lever and then pulls the bolt back like that, assuming your key is cut correctly, which this one is not for that, but that is how that works. And we will again get to more detailed on the keys because there is kind of a lot to go over on the keys. Now our spring that I messed up in the first video, we now know that it goes through this notch. If we refer back to our picture like I should have done in that other video, this little peg is what holds it. It wraps around this post, and now when it wraps around that post, it gives me the spring pressure and it pushes down on that. So how I had it before in the last video was I had it carefully balanced there and it would have immediately locked up. When I flipped it with a key and made it move, this would have fallen off of that. So again, that was my mistake. I was trying to get done with the video and I just was not paying attention, which you really should not do in this business. You need to pay attention to what you're doing. Okay, we got everything back together again, and we're going to take our cap. Everything's seated. Just take our cap, put it on. It goes together very nicely, like it should have in the first video. And find our screw and tighten it down. So that is all there is to basically just refurbishing the lock to get back in use. We did not, obviously we did not totally sand all that down. You'd lose your logo if you start trying to get all those scratches off. Your logo is going to become lighter, and a lot of times people are going to just not worry about that, or invariably they're going to just come along and paint it up. So if you have already made your key for this, you would want to check your key. I don't think any of these are cut, so we will definitely have to go over that when the time comes. This one may work. That 5 lever's got a real deep cut. Nope. Maybe. Nope. But whatever the case is, I don't think I have any on here that is gonna work correctly. Oh, there we go. So that, now see, that didn't pull all the way in, but until we get to the actual key making part of it. It has number 5 there, so that's probably number 5 Yale key, which you can look up. Check your knob. Make sure your latch is springing in and out, which is almost always really the main thing that you want to get working. Not a lot of people, even in the old houses, not a lot of people really care about the key part of it, but they do want their door to latch to, you know, contain. With older houses like this, there's heating issues and air conditioning issues, so a lot of times people want to close their doors to make sure that the heating or the AC stays in one room or stays away from one part of the house, because it is fairly expensive to do heating and air conditioning. We see that's a little loose. We could take it back apart and kind of crimp that in a little bit. However, it's not necessary, because when you tighten this back on the door with these 2 screws, it should hold it. But assuming you did not want to do that and you wanted it to be ideal, we see why it's so rattly right there. You can easily take a pair of pliers, easily, but you have to do it carefully, because like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, you don't want that to mess up in any way. So you could crimp that a little tighter to make it not as wobbly there. But once you tighten it down in the door and the knob is through it and everything, it typically stays just fine. And you are good to go for another 50 to 60 years of service until it gets painted up again. I appreciate all you guys watching, and definitely stay tuned for the key making part of the video. I'm kind of glad that I'm going to split it up, because the key making part is going to be a little bit kind of knowledge intensified or whatever. But stay tuned for that. That'll be part 3. Take my rubbers off, and appreciate you watching, guys. If you have any questions or comments, hit me up in the comment section. Yeah, and make sure and like and subscribe. Appreciate you watching, and can't wait to see you for the next one. Peace.